are the 1960s in America, a time when the world seemed both bigger and smaller at once, when streets were alive with the hum of possibility, and when ordinary life carried with it a flavor we can hardly imagine today. Imagine stepping into a morning in a small American town, your shoes crunching against the freshly poured asphalt, the smell of gasoline mingling with the aroma of sizzling bacon from the diner on Main Street. You'd see the neighborhood paperboy pedaling furiously down the sidewalks, tossing rolled-up newspapers with such precision that not a single home missed the news. Children rode their bicycles without helmets, carefree, weaving in and out of the summer air. A game of stickball would erupt right in the middle of a quiet residential street, and cars, big, shiny and loud, would glide by as if the world itself had been built to accommodate their chrome and power. Speed limits were suggestions, not. Laws and seatbelts were considered optional, a novelty that only a few safety-minded folks even thought about. The air smelled of freedom, of possibility, and of cigarettes. Everywhere. Cafes, diners, offices, even the back seat of cars. People smoked casually, and no one batted an eye if your mother or father lit up at the dinner table while discussing the latest news from the space race. Tobacco. Ads plastered every magazine, promising elegance, sophistication, or a rugged charm that defined masculinity. Smoking wasn't just allowed, it was celebrated. In the grocery stores, aisles were a maze of wonder. Prepackaged foods were exploding onto the market. Powdered cake mixes, canned tuna salads, TV dinners neatly arranged in aluminum trays. Housewives, often wearing aprons over carefully pressed dresses, pushed metal carts down fluorescent-lit aisles, checking off lists of products that promised convenience and modernity. Frozen peas and green beans, absolutely. Instant mashed potatoes, a miracle. And yet, despite all these innovations, fresh produce from local farms was still king. People knew their farmers, shook their hands, and took pride in the colors of carrots, tomatoes, and corn. Television had become the hearth of the home, a flickering window into a world that seemed both near and impossibly far. Families would gather every evening to watch shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, marveling at acts from around the world, singers, dancers, acrobats, even comedy sketches that today might feel quaint. The TV itself was a bulky box, often encased in rich wood, taking pride of place in the living room. The sound of the black and white picture being tuned, the hum of the cathode ray tube, these were the comforting noises of domestic life. And cars. Oh, the cars. They weren't just transportation. They were statements. Families piled into massive sedans with fins that could almost touch the sky, engines that roared like lions, and radios that played rock and roll so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of suburban America. Tail fins weren't merely aesthetic, they were a declaration of style, of identity. Road trips were adventures, and gas stations were oases where you could chat with attendants, often in crisp uniforms, and maybe even get your tires checked, without leaving the driver's seat. Meanwhile, downtown streets thrived with life. Soda fountains were temples of social interaction, with teenagers leaning over marble counters, sipping Coca-Colas or malted milkshakes, spinning around the stools with the ease of carefree youth. Jukeboxes played the latest hits by the Beatles, the Supremes, or Elvis Presley, while couples held hands shyly, learning the rituals of courtship without the intrusion of smartphones or social media. Every song carried with it a feeling of both rebellion and hope, of dreams that felt tangible and just within reach. Yet alongside this nostalgic charm, life in the 1960s was governed by rules and norms that today seem almost unimaginable. Gender. Roles were rigidly defined. Men worked outside, women stayed home, and the world moved with a rhythm that dictated behavior, attire, and expectations. A man without a suit and tie to work might be judged. A woman without a dress, pearls, and carefully coiffed hair might raise eyebrows. And yet, These constraints also created a stage for extraordinary creativity, the kind that would fuel the counterculture and revolutionary changes that the decade would eventually explode with. In schools, children wrote with ink pens, carefully, dipping them into inkwells at the corner of wooden desks. Hallways smelled of polished floors, chalk dust, and sometimes freshly baked bread from the cafeteria. Recess involved climbing metal jungle gyms, playing tag, and listening to the distant, almost musical call of the ice cream truck. Corporal punishment was common, a tool of discipline that now would shock parents today, yet back then was considered normal, a way to instill respect and obedience. The streets at night had their own rhythm. Neon signs flickered softly, casting gentle colors onto rain-slicked sidewalks. People walked without fear of constant surveillance. There were no smartphones, no constant connectivity, yet somehow the world felt full. News traveled through word of mouth, newspapers, radio and television broadcasts. Families communicated face-to-face. Neighbors knew each other's names, birthdays, and even favorite flavors of ice cream. Communities weren't just geographic, they were deeply social, woven with trust and familiarity that seems rare today. And of course, the culture of consumption flourished in ways that might surprise modern sensibilities. Cigarette companies advertised on billboards with images of doctors recommending their products. Car commercials promised freedom and status, often ignoring practical concerns like fuel efficiency or safety. Advertising was unabashedly persuasive, a spectacle that shaped desire in ways both playful and profound. People eagerly embraced new products, believing in the modern dream, the promise that life was becoming easier, brighter, and more exciting with each passing innovation. Yet, amid all this, there was a simplicity to daily life. Children played outside until the streetlights flickered on. Families sat around the dinner table, talking, laughing, sharing stories without checking phones or scrolling endlessly. Sundays meant church, drives in the countryside, or picnics by the lake. Life was slower, but in that slowness every moment carried weight, texture, and resonance, and as the decade progressed, changes started to ripple through society. Music became louder, bolder, more confrontational. Ideas about civil rights, gender, equality, and social justice began to stir, juxtaposed against a backdrop of suburban calm, diners, soda fountains, and quiet streets. It was a world in transition, holding on to nostalgia while inching toward revolution. As we drift further into the 1960s, the morning routines of everyday Americans were themselves little time capsules of a world so different from ours today. Picture a father stepping into the kitchen, grabbing the morning newspaper, and lighting a cigarette while reading the headlines. The radio would play a steady stream of news, weather, and music, often before the television even flickered to. Breakfasts were hearty. Eggs fried in butter, toast with jelly, a generous helping of bacon or sausage, and coffee poured from a percolator that hissed like a miniature steam engine. Children drank milk from glass bottles delivered daily by the milkman, who wore a crisp uniform and smiled at every doorstep. At work, offices were a theater of etiquette and hierarchy. Typewriters clacked in symphonies of productivity, and secretaries, expertly poised in skirts and blouses, typed letters with precision. Carbon paper produced duplicates, and mistakes meant starting over, often with a sigh and the subtle annoyance of wasted paper. Telephones were tethered to desks, cords stretching like vines across cubicles, and long-distance calls were precious, expensive, and often limited to important news. Fax machines were still science fiction, and computers were giant, mysterious machines reserved for universities and large corporations. The idea of personal computing was decades away, and yet people managed to live, work, and communicate with astonishing efficiency. On the streets, Children walked home from school carrying metal lunchboxes adorned with superheroes or cartoon characters, jingling softly with a thermos tucked inside. Ice cream trucks rolled by at predictable times, and neighborhood kids would run, coins clutched tightly in hand, to claim their vanilla cones or popsicles. There were no parental apps tracking every movement, no GPS devices, no cameras documenting each second. Trust was implicit. Communities were self-policing, friendly and safe, or at least perceived as safe in ways that today might feel naive. Public transportation had its own peculiar charm. Buses rumbled through towns with conductors collecting fares in coins, exchanging polite greetings with passengers, and announcing stops in voices that carried over the engine's hum. Subway stations in bigger cities had attendants who helped with tickets, cleaned the platforms, and sometimes even offered directions to lost tourists. The smell of the city mingled with the aroma of coffee shops, bakeries, and the faint tang of coal or oil from heating systems. Life moved slower, yet somehow more connected. Fashion was an unmistakable marker of time. Men wore fedora hats and sharply pressed suits almost every day. Women donned gloves, stockings, and dresses that swished around the knees as they walked, often accompanied by carefully styled hair. And subtle, yet elegant makeup. Teenagers rebelled with leather jackets, blue jeans, and greased-back hair, the early signs of rock and roll rebellion that would define an entire generation. And yet, these expressions of style carried they signified identity, social status, and the boundaries of propriety. Entertainment was, in many ways, a shared experience. Movie theaters were temples of excitement, their lobbies filled with the smell of popcorn, soda, and candy. Double features were common, often accompanied by newsreels that transported audiences to distant parts of the globe. Drive-in theaters became cultural landmarks where families could watch the latest blockbuster from the comfort of their cars, car horns occasionally honking in reaction to thrilling scenes or unexpected scares. Imagine teenagers leaning forward in the front seat, their date's hand nervously in theirs, sharing a moment that would be remembered for a lifetime, all without the interruptions of phones, streaming services, or social media notifications. The idea of hygiene and beauty standards also reflects a time that seems almost alien today. Barbershops were social hubs for men, where the clippers buzzed in unison with conversations about sports, politics, and gossip. Hair salons for women were fragrant with the smell of peroxide, hairspray, and curlers. Women endured hours under hooded dryers, achieving styles that required patience and dedication. Bathing habits were different too. Bubble baths with strong scented soaps were luxurious, yet showers were rare, and public pools and community baths were common gathering points for families. In the realm of technology, inventions were just beginning to reshape daily life. Televisions were still black and white for most households, and color broadcasts were a luxury. Rotary phones required patience, their dial returning slowly with a satisfying click as numbers were selected. Refrigerators hummed in kitchens, but freezers were smaller, and ice cube trays needed careful attention. Cars, while mechanical marvels, were sometimes temperamental, requiring frequent visits to gas stations or local mechanics. Yet all of these inconveniences were accepted as normal. People adjusted, persevered, and even celebrated the small triumphs over mechanical failure or household mishaps. School life was vivid and immersive. Students learned cursive writing, arithmetic with chalk on blackboards, and history lessons that often reflected the prevailing social narratives of the time. Teachers wielded authority that was rarely questioned, yet the education system also fostered creativity through arts, music, and physical education. Children marched in playground games, recited poems aloud, and participated in community events that tied their education to the rhythm of local life. No digital screens intruded upon their attention. No online quizzes replaced the thrill of reciting knowledge aloud. No virtual classrooms. Learning was physical, tactile, and social. Even the weekends had a distinct flavor. Families packed picnics for local parks, attended parades, or simply drove out of town in the family car, windows down, hair blowing, radios playing the latest hits. Sunday drives were common, a way to see the countryside, visit distant relatives, or simply enjoy the freedom of motion. These experiences were communal, often spontaneous, yet structured in a rhythm that balanced work, play, and social obligations. And of course, the cultural contradictions of the 1960s were ever present. People could embrace extreme modern conveniences and yet adhere strictly to traditional norms. Men smoked in offices, women wore gloves to mail letters, teenagers danced wildly to new rock music while their parents shook their heads, and societal expectations dictated both decorum and rebellion in equal measure. The tension between innovation and tradition, freedom and restriction, nostalgia and progress created a world rich in paradox, a world that today feels both impossibly distant and intimately familiar. Step into an afternoon in 1960s America, and you might be surprised at the contradictions, the rhythms, and the quirks of daily life. Consider the world of advertising, which dominated every corner of existence. Billboards shouted promises of perfection, a cigarette a day keeps your worries away, or buy our cleaning product and your house will sparkle like never before. It wasn't just commercial, it was theatrical, bold, unapologetic. Children's cereals were advertised with cartoon mascots, whose voices seemed to leap from the television screen, declaring that sugar-laden breakfast choices would make mornings magical. Toothpaste promised dazzling smiles in 15 days. Laundry. Detergents claimed miracles, and even automobiles were sold as tickets to happiness and social prestige. Today, such blatant exaggeration might trigger outrage or lawsuits, but back then it was accepted with excitement and a touch of awe. Lunch meant something very different from our grab-and-go culture. Cafeterias in schools served hot meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and gravy, sometimes with a jello dessert that wobbled like a colorful edible sculpture. Workers carried metal lunch pails filled with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, apples, and perhaps a small treat tucked into a corner. And the aroma of diners' kitchens, fried chicken, burgers, pies, permeated the streets, luring in anyone within a few blocks. Portion sizes were generous, food additives were unregulated, and people indulged without guilt. It was a culinary freedom that seems almost reckless today. Transportation carried its own peculiarities. Bus stops had schedules printed on small signs, yet the punctuality depended more on luck than precision. Children sometimes rode unrestrained in the back seat of family cars, sprawled across bench seats, windows down, hair flying in the wind. Highways were less congested, and cars with tail fins glided past farms, factories, and motels with neon lights blinking like beacons in the night. The concept of car seats for infants was barely discussed, and seatbelts, where present, were optional accessories rather than legal requirements. People relied on skill, instinct, and trust more than regulations, an approach that seems daring, even dangerous today. In the evening, entertainment extended beyond the home. Bowling alleys were community centers, ringing with the clatter of pins and the laughter of friends. Roller rinks were vivid arenas of light, sound, and motion, with teenagers skating to the latest pop hits. Dance halls were alive with swing, jitterbug, and the beginnings of more rebellious rock styles. Men and women dressed for these outings, polishing shoes, shining hair, and applying just the right touch of makeup or cologne. These social rituals were meticulous, intentional, and celebratory, a stark contrast to the casual digital meetups of today. Shopping was also an experience unlike what we know now. Department stores were sprawling palaces of goods, with sales clerks attending to customers in neatly pressed uniforms. You could touch, smell, and try nearly everything. Makeup counters offered demonstrations, while hat departments displayed rows of fine, carefully crafted headwear. Children wandered with their parents, fascinated by the novelty of packaged candies and toys. Today, online shopping might seem faster, easier, and more convenient, but it can never replicate the tactile delight and social interaction of these vibrant, bustling stores. At home, leisure had its own strange elegance. Radios crackled with music and serial dramas, transporting listeners into imaginary worlds. Families played board games around wooden tables, the clatter of dice and the laughter of participants filling rooms. In basements, fathers tinkered with model trains or built elaborate woodworking projects, while mothers attended to sewing machines or baking experiments. Vacations were often road trips, families piling into massive sedans with luggage tied precariously to the roof. Maps were paper, and directions relied on curiosity, observation, and the kindness of strangers at gas stations or diners. There were no GPS devices, no instant search engines, yet somehow people managed to navigate miles and miles with surprising accuracy. Life in 1960s America also included habits and customs that are almost unimaginable today. Smoking in offices and restaurants, once ubiquitous, now seems shocking. Public swimming pools were packed with sunbathers, children splashing, and lifeguards issuing commands through whistles rather than electronic signals. Town fairs and carnivals were epic events, with rides that would now be subject to strict safety inspections, games of chance with tangible prizes, and food booths selling hot dogs, cotton candy, and deep-fried treats with wild abandon. Even small-town parades were grand spectacles, with marching bands, floats, and banners celebrating everything from local heroes to national pride. And in the realm of communication, postcards and handwritten letters were the lifeblood of personal connection. People wrote to relatives, friends, and even pen pals across the globe, their handwriting a reflection of personality, care, and time invested. Phone calls were reserved for important news or emergencies. Casual chatting was often face-to-face, a ritual that today seems both nostalgic and extraordinary. Communities were intimate. Everyone knew each other, or at least had a passing acquaintance, and gossip traveled faster than any news app could today. The cultural backdrop was rich with music, politics, and societal tension. Rock and roll, Motown, and the early sounds of folk music filled radios and living rooms, while protests, civil rights movements, and political debates simmered in the streets. The tension between tradition and progress was palpable, while diners and bowling alleys maintained their familiar charm. University campuses and city centers were alive with the fervor of change. People navigated this duality daily, balancing comfort and rebellion, nostalgia and revolution, in a world that seemed at once safe and electric with possibility. As the sun dipped behind small-town rooftops and city skylines, families gathered. For dinner, stories and reflection. Candles flickered, radios hummed softly, and televisions, now turned onto a late-night show or news program, cast shadows across living rooms. Children recounted the adventures of the day. Parents shared insights or worries, and life proceeded with a rhythm that balanced predictability and spontaneity. Every action, from lighting a cigarette to pouring a glass of milk, carried with it the imprint of a culture that prized both ceremony and freedom. As the 1960s moved onward, everyday life carried with it customs and practices that now seem almost surreal. Take medicine and healthcare, for instance. Doctors made house calls a routine part of life, not an emergency luxury. People visited clinics where waiting rooms were calm and quiet, filled with magazines that might have seemed outdated by today's standards, yet they were cherished. Vaccinations were administered with little fanfare, sometimes without the layers of consent forms we now consider essential. Antibiotics were dispensed freely, often for minor ailments, and prescription regulations were far looser than anything we recognize today. Smoking while waiting for a checkup was not unusual, and the concept of protective gear, safety protocols, or patient privacy was far less rigid than modern law now mandates. Children's health practices also tell a story of stark contrast. Playground injuries were accepted as part of growing up. Scraped knees and bruised elbows were badges of honor, shared stories at the dinner table. Swimming lessons occurred in community pools without lifeguard-to-child ratios strictly monitored. Safety helmets for bikes? Optional. Car seats? Almost unheard of. Kids explored and learned risk, cultivating independence in ways that today might feel terrifying. Education itself held a structured yet curious world. Schools enforced strict dress codes, corporal punishment, and rigid hierarchies between students and teachers. Yet, within those walls, creativity thrived. Art classes encouraged expression, music programs filled hallways with rehearsals of band, and choir and library periods were magical adventures through rows of books that students touched, smelled, and physically carried. There were no e-books, no computers in the classroom, no online databases. Learning was tangible, interactive, and rooted in direct experience. Sports and physical activity were central to both community life and personal identity. Friday night. Football games drew entire towns, with marching bands, cheerleaders, and fans who filled bleachers with anticipation. Kids played kickball, stickball, and hopscotch in streets and yards. Baseball leagues thrived in local parks, and even adults found time for softball tournaments, bowling leagues, and weekend bike races. These activities weren't just for fun. They forged identity, camaraderie, and community pride. Unlike today's specialized, highly structured youth sports, participation was inclusive, casual, and often improvised. Advertising to children, by modern standards, was astonishingly audacious. Television commercials promoted sugary cereals as keys to happiness, toys as gateways to adventure, and bubblegum as a path to social success. It was a world where parents were expected to indulge whims, where marketing shaped desires without scrutiny, and where the line between fantasy and reality was cheerfully blurred. Toys were often simple, yet they demanded imagination. Wooden blocks, toy trains, dolls with hand-painted faces, model kits that required patience and assembly. Today, children's marketing is tightly regulated, but then it was a playground of persuasion and promise. Public etiquette carried its own flavor of absurdity. Men tipped their hats to ladies passing by, strangers exchanged polite pleasantries in elevators, and queues were orderly, social events in themselves. Telephone conversations were private yet limited. Messages were often left on handwritten slips or with secretaries who understood the social rhythm of their bosses' lives. Banking required trips to the branch. Checkbooks were carefully balanced, and ATMs were rare or non-existent. People interacted with institutions, businesses, and neighbors in ways that demanded patience, attention, and personal engagement, a stark contrast to today's instant digital transactions. Cultural pop phenomena were omnipresent and vivid. The Beatles' mania swept through towns, radios, and diners, bringing teenagers to dance crazes that were both synchronized and wildly individualistic. Movies showcased glamorous stars like Marilyn Monroe or James Dean, whose images influenced fashion, behavior, and aspirations. Comic books thrived in corner stores, offering fantastical escapes from daily life, while music albums were carefully selected, purchased, and discussed, their influence tangible in social gatherings and community dances. There were no digital playlists or streaming algorithms. Music was discovery, negotiation, and experience. Even the dining experience extended into extraordinary rituals. Drive-thrus existed, but were in their infancy. Diners served meals with counter service, bustling with clatter and conversation. Restaurants advertised dishes with exaggeration, promising the world's best pie or burgers grilled to perfection by real chefs. Fast food chains were emerging, yet homemade meals retained pride of place. Recipes passed through generations, and communal eating remained a cherished, almost sacred act. And finally, public spaces carried an energy both familiar and alien. Parks, sidewalks, and streets were alive with human presence. Children played freely, adults strolled leisurely, friends gathered to chat, and neighbors maintained a tangible sense of community. Trash disposal, pedestrian rules, and public safety were governed more by social expectation than formal regulation. Street fairs, parades, and block parties created a tapestry of engagement, where every participant felt the pulse of life in a way that digital connectivity today cannot replicate. It was a time of contradictions, freedom alongside regulation, indulgence alongside restraint, innovation alongside tradition. Life in 1960s America carried absurdities, charms, dangers, and delights that seem almost impossible to imagine today, yet they formed the texture of a world that was vibrant, connected, and endlessly memorable. As the afternoon faded into evening, the daily rhythms of 1960s America revealed even more peculiarities that today would seem unimaginable. Homes were designed with practicality and formality in mind, yet they bore the unmistakable stamp of style and innovation. Families gathered around sturdy wooden tables for dinner, each member expected to sit in their assigned chair, napkins neatly folded, the conversation carefully balanced between news of the day and light-hearted anecdotes. Telephones sat on polished tables, rotary dials turning slowly as calls were made, often interrupted by the ring of the party line, shared among neighbors and requiring polite patience. Household chores were both elaborate and meticulously performed. Women scrubbed floors with brushes and mop buckets, ironed clothes with heavy irons heated on stoves, and washed dishes by hand, even if dishwashers were becoming more common. Children helped, often learning a sense of responsibility through these daily tasks, while parents imparted wisdom in the form of advice, discipline, and gentle guidance. The home was both a sanctuary and a workshop, a space where life's practicalities and rituals intertwined seamlessly. Transportation in this era carried a sense of spectacle. Cars were massive, flamboyantly styled, and unashamedly loud. Families often piled in for road trips without the safety gear we now consider essential. Tires were checked manually, gas stations doubled as community hubs, and roadside attractions offered entertainment, often featuring bizarre or whimsical spectacles designed to capture the attention of passing motorists. Motorcycles roared through streets, often with riders bareheaded, while pedestrians navigated sidewalks without crosswalk signals or heavy traffic control. Trust and instinct dictated movement. Even leisure had its share of absurdity. Backyard barbecues were common, with meat cooked over open flames, often seasoned generously, sometimes dangerously, for taste rather than health. Ice cream socials, picnics in the park, and community. Dances were social necessities, where etiquette, style, and conversation mattered as much as the food and entertainment. People often participated in recreational activities that required physical courage, swimming in rivers without lifeguards, hiking rugged trails with minimal equipment, and playing sports in neighborhood streets with impromptu rules. Political engagement had its own theatrical flavor. Town halls and local gatherings allowed citizens to debate, argue, and influence decisions directly. Newspapers were dense with editorial content, letters to the editor carried weight, and television. News broadcasts became central forums for national discourse. People read, discussed, and often acted on political ideas with a depth of personal involvement that seems extraordinary today, in an era dominated by digital soundbites and ephemeral opinions. Communication, as mentioned, relied on direct human Interaction. Face-to-face conversation was prized, letters and postcards were treasured, and telegraph services were still utilized for urgent, distant messages. News traveled slower, yes, but it also carried context, weight, and human interpretation. People were attuned to the subtleties of tone, body language, and social cues, skills that today's instant messaging has rendered almost obsolete. Even personal safety and public regulation were approached with a kind of charming laxity. Street. Lighting, traffic signals, and public warnings existed, but were far less comprehensive. Children walked to school alone, explored neighborhoods, and played freely in streets with minimal adult supervision. People trusted each other, relied on community vigilance, and often took risks that modern sensibilities would deem reckless. Yet somehow, the social fabric held firm, knit together by shared norms, trust, and a common understanding of acceptable behavior. Cultural consumption was similarly immersive. Families attended drive-in theaters, watched live performances, and listened to radio dramas with an intensity that made the experience communal and participatory. Children read comic books voraciously, adults debated the latest literature, and music was both an art form and a social catalyst. The lines between entertainment, education, and socialization were fluid, blending seamlessly into the rhythms of everyday life. And in the quiet moments, the absurdities of daily life became most apparent. People smoked indoors freely. Children climbed trees without supervision. Towns held parades, celebrating nearly every conceivable occasion. And fashion dictated social hierarchy in ways both subtle and overt. The blend of strict etiquette with carefree indulgence created a paradoxical culture, structured yet spontaneous, conservative yet experimental, ordinary yet endlessly fascinating. By nightfall, streets emptied except for the occasional family, returning from a late picnic or a drive-in movie. Neon lights flickered, radio shows broadcast dramatic stories, and homes glowed warmly, reflecting lives full of routines, risks, pleasures, and absurdities that we can hardly imagine today. Life in 1960s America was a delicate dance between tradition and change, safety and adventure, simplicity and spectacle, a world both alien and intimately familiar, waiting to be remembered, narrated, and felt once again. As evening turned into night, the cultural pulse of 1960s America came alive in ways that now seem almost fantastical. Festivals and fairs were monumental, drawing entire communities together for days of celebration. County fairs featured livestock competitions, tractor pulls, pie-eating contests, and Ferris wheels that creaked under the night sky. The smell of popcorn, cotton candy, and fried dough mingled with the laughter of children and the shouts of game operators trying to entice patrons to win a stuffed animal or a goldfish. Today, strict regulations, permits, and liability insurance would make such events nearly impossible to organize with the same spontaneity. Back then, people thrived on improvisation, community spirit, and a shared sense of excitement. Travel, too, carried a romantic absurdity. Families loaded enormous sedans with luggage strapped to the roofs, children sprawled across bench seats, and picnic baskets filled with sandwiches, pies, and thermoses. Highways were scenic, loosely monitored, and filled with curious roadside attractions. A giant pink elephant, a world's largest ball of twine, or a tiny museum dedicated to some local hero. Gas stations offered more than fuel. They were places to swap stories, buy postcards, and enjoy the camaraderie of the road. The concept of GPS didn't exist. Maps were folded with care, and parents relied on instinct, intuition, and the occasional roadside stranger for directions. Advertising permeated every facet of life in ways that are almost shocking today. Television, print, and radio were saturated with claims that seem preposterous by modern standards. Toothpaste guaranteed dazzling smiles. Cigarettes promised charm, success, and sophistication. Breakfast cereals suggested happiness and vitality. In brightly colored boxes, even products aimed at children were marketed with theatrical exaggeration, promising toys that could change your life, or candies that made mornings magical. There was no regulation on advertising content, no consumer watchdogs, and yet people embraced these messages with excitement, trust, and sometimes blind faith. Radio held a special place in the cultural ecosystem. Families gathered around large, tabletop radios to hear the latest music hits, dramatic serials, or national news. DJs became local celebrities, shaping taste and culture with their selections, their voices carrying across towns, influencing behavior and fashion. Listeners memorized jingles, sang along to pop songs, and debated the merits of the latest hits. Radio wasn't just entertainment, it was a unifying force, a social glue, and a conduit for dreams and aspirations. Youth culture was vibrant, experimental, and often shocking to adults. Teenagers flocked to dance halls, roller rinks, and local diners, experimenting with new styles, music, and attitudes. Rock and roll challenged social norms, Motown inspired movement and joy, and folk music carried messages of change and protest. Teen fashion was bold. Leather jackets, blue jeans, and iconic hairstyles defined identity. Yet this rebellion coexisted with community participation, helping in family businesses, attending school functions, and engaging in local politics. Young people navigated the tension between tradition and self-expression, often crafting entirely new social rules in the process. Politics, meanwhile, permeated conversation, public events, and even entertainment. Town hall meetings, local rallies, and public debates allowed citizens to engage directly with decision-makers. Newspapers carried detailed editorials, letters to the editor were taken seriously, and television broadcasts brought national figures into living rooms across the country. Citizens were active participants in democracy, discussing policy, challenging authority, and shaping the cultural narrative. The immediacy of today's social media was absent, yet the depth of engagement was profound. Public customs and etiquette, once so formal, now feel almost theatrical. Men tipped hats, women wore gloves, and even casual outings were conducted with awareness of social hierarchy and propriety. Courtship rituals were elaborate, dances carefully choreographed, and conversations navigated with politeness and restraint. Humor, gossip, and storytelling were central to everyday life, and the rhythm of social interaction demanded attention, memory, and presence. In a world without smartphones, digital distractions, or instant messaging, humans truly connected through conversation, laughter, and shared experience, and the absurdities of daily life were everywhere. People smoked indoors without hesitation, children roamed neighborhoods freely, parades celebrated nearly every imaginable occasion, and fashion dictated not only style, but social position. Life was simultaneously structured and spontaneous, ordinary yet filled with marvel. Each day held rituals that were both practical and theatrical, blending efficiency with charm, safety with daring, and tradition with emerging modernity. As the night deepened, small towns and big cities alike settled into quiet rhythms. Families returned from evening excursions, radios played softly in living rooms, and televisions displayed black and white images flickering against wood-paneled walls. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks where neighbors exchanged parting words. Children finished last-minute homework, and adults reflected on the day's labor, leisure, and absurdities. Life in 1960s America was a tapestry of contradictions, adventures, and rituals, each thread weaving a picture that feels at once impossibly distant and intimately familiar. It was a world where smoking in restaurants was normal. Children roamed streets without helmets. Tail fins defined status, radio voices were iconic, advertising was unabashedly exaggerated, and the balance between tradition and innovation created a rhythm uniquely its own. One could walk down a street and feel simultaneously nostalgic and astonished, realizing that a single decade could contain so much: joy, freedom, absurdity, and change. As the 1960s drew on, life in America continued to be a tapestry of absurdities and charm. Consider the habits that defined daily existence, yet would seem unimaginable today. People casually drank soda from glass bottles with metal caps, opening them with a flick of a small opener that every household kept within reach. Ice cream cones melted quickly in the sun as children ran through sprinklers without worry of modern allergies or parental alerts. Family dogs roamed freely through yards and streets, unrestrained, a constant presence in life's background, and cats were left to wander the neighborhoods, mysteriously appearing on porches and windowsills. Public spaces were arenas of spontaneity. Street games were common. Stickball, jump rope, tag, and hopscotch occupied sidewalks, alleys, and parks. Children often rode bikes with no helmets, weaving through traffic that was slower, yes, but unregulated in ways we now consider risky. Neighbors waved, exchanged small talk, and kept informal eyes on one another's children, a social safety net that technology has since replaced with surveillance and monitoring. Communities thrived on trust, shared experience, and a sense of mutual responsibility, a social fabric more intimate than what modern life usually affords. Entertainment and leisure often reached levels of delightful absurdity. Drive-in movie theaters were cultural landmarks, where families and teenagers watched films from the comfort of cars, sharing snacks and exchanging whispered commentary during key scenes. Roller rinks were alive with disco lights before disco, skaters spinning and gliding to the rock and roll and Motown hits of the era. Soda fountains offered root beer floats, sundaes, and malted milkshakes served by countermen in starched uniforms who remembered each customer's favorite order. Even arcade games were mechanical marvels, coins clinking in slots, levers pulled, and lights flashing in hypnotic rhythm, a playground of sound, movement, and competition. Even shopping was theatrical. Department stores displayed mannequins in carefully coordinated outfits, while sales clerks offered advice with charm and flair. Children marveled at toys behind glass, candy displayed in vivid rows, and windows decorated elaborately for holidays. Every outing to the store was part adventure, part social engagement, and part lesson in consumer culture. The ritual of selecting, examining, and purchasing goods was as much about experience as necessity. In homes, absurdities were commonplace yet cherished. Telephones rang through party lines, where neighbors listened in politely until their own number was called. Black and white televisions offered drama, comedy, and news, while the flicker of cathode ray tubes cast shadows across living rooms. Parents often smoked indoors without concern. Children studied or played under watchful but relaxed supervision, and meals were communal experiences rich with conversation, laughter, and sometimes disagreement. Even chores carried a theatrical quality. Ironing, scrubbing, baking, and mending were as much rituals as responsibilities, blending practicality with ceremony. Social norms were strict, yet riddled with exceptions that today seem surreal. Women in public wore dresses, hats, and gloves. Men wore suits and ties even on casual outings. Teenagers tested boundaries with leather jackets, music, and hairstyles that shocked parents. Smoking, drinking, and flirtation carried codified rules. And yet these same acts were common, casual, and embedded into daily life. It was a delicate dance between rebellion and tradition, freedom and etiquette, a dance that gave the decade its unmistakable rhythm. Evenings often ended with storytelling and reflection. Families listened to radio shows, recounting thrilling adventures, comedic sketches, or dramatic serials. Children drifted off to sleep in rooms illuminated by soft nightlights, their imagination alive with the day's adventures. Adults discussed politics, community events, and daily achievements, while newspapers awaited the morning read, keeping the rhythm of knowledge and engagement alive. Life was lived in cycles, rituals, and tangible experiences, hands-on, ears listening, eyes observing, minds absorbing. Ultimately, the 1960s in America were defined by contrasts: carefreeness and responsibility, structure and spontaneity, absurdity and elegance. Smoking indoors was normal. Cars were massive and unsafe by modern standards. Children played freely without helmets or supervision. Advertising was brazen, persuasive, and theatrical. Community life was intensely personal, and entertainment was immersive and participatory. Every element of daily existence carried texture, rhythm, and significance, creating a world simultaneously alien and familiar, absurd and charming, ordinary and unforgettable. As we imagine walking down the streets of a 1960s town, hearing the echo of laughter, the hum of radios, the roar of chrome cars, and the scent of freshly baked pies, we are reminded that life then was a carefully balanced theater of experience. It was a world of sensory richness, communal engagement, and audacious customs, one that today feels impossibly distant, yet resonates with a deep, nostalgic familiarity. In the end, 1960s America teaches us that ordinary life can be extraordinary, that absurdities can define culture, and that the rhythms of daily existence, rituals, leisure, work, play, and connection shape a society in ways that linger long after the decade itself has passed. It was a world of imagination made real, of freedom tempered by etiquette, and of experiences so vivid that they continue to captivate, surprise, and inspire us today. And as the night settles over quiet streets, the neon glow fades, radios whisper their final tunes, and families sleep under the gentle watch of a decade both remarkable and improbable, we are left with a profound appreciation for the absurd, the ordinary, and the unforgettable charm of 1960s America. Imagine stepping into a 1960s town in America, where transportation is not just a necessity, but a spectacle, a reflection of status, culture, and lifestyle. Cars are massive machines, gleaming with chrome and fins, built not merely for movement, but for admiration. Driving down a suburban street or a highway, you can hear the low rumble of engines, the occasional honk of horns, and the cheerful chatter of passengers enjoying the breeze from rolled-down windows. Seatbelts are rare, airbags non-existent, and yet families navigate roads with remarkable confidence, relying on intuition, skill, and experience. Bus travel is a cornerstone of public life. City buses arrive at stops according to schedules that may or may not align with reality. Passengers, a mixture of workers, students, and homemakers, chat, read newspapers, or simply stare out the window at passing neighborhoods. The interior is Spartan, with metal benches and the faint aroma of dust and rubber, yet it hums with life and community. Rural bus routes connect distant towns, winding along two-lane highways bordered by cornfields, farms, and rolling hills. Travelers often pack lunch pails or thermoses, sharing snacks and conversation with strangers who feel like neighbors for the brief journey. Rail travel is another thread of the 1960s transportation tapestry. Steam engines give way to sleek, diesel locomotives, carrying passengers between cities with a sense of ceremony and adventure. Train stations are bustling hubs, with porters carrying luggage, ticket agents stamping passes, and families bidding farewell on wooden platforms. Windows offer views of endless fields, small towns, and industrial landscapes, all passing by in a rhythm that seems both slow and exhilarating. Traveling by train is an event, a journey to be savored rather than rushed, in contrast to today's hyper-efficient but impersonal transit. Highways are arteries of exploration, lined with neon signs, motels, diners, and curious roadside attractions. Families embark on road trips that may last days or weeks, loaded with suitcases tied atop roof racks, children sprawled across bench seats, and the occasional picnic basket spilling over with sandwiches, pies, and thermoses of coffee. Gas stations are social hubs where attendants pump fuel, check oil, and sometimes provide directions, stories, or the latest gossip. Rest stops are dotted with maps, vending machines, and public restrooms. Rudimentary, yes, but full of charm. Motels, emerging as a phenomenon, dot the highways with neon lights and kitschy architecture. Each sign promises comfort, cleanliness, and convenience, though standards vary wildly. Travelers compare room decor, bathroom sizes, and roadside attractions as part of the adventure. Many motels feature swimming pools, jukeboxes in lobbies, and small diners attached, creating mini-universes for families, couples, and road-weary adventurers. Today, chain hotels dominate, but in the 1960s, every stop is unique, colorful, and memorable. Bicycles are another emblem of freedom. Children ride through neighborhoods without helmets, sometimes two on a single bike, racing along sidewalks or weaving through streets. Adults use bicycles for errands, recreation, or simply to enjoy the afternoon breeze. Bike paths are rare, streets double as playgrounds, and a sense of trust governs the interactions between cyclists, pedestrians, and motorists. Taxis in city centers are noisy, bustling, and charismatic. Drivers memorize routes, negotiate fares, and chat freely with passengers. Neon signs flicker above taxi stands, and hailing a cab requires skill, timing, and a bit of luck. Inside, the smell of upholstery, cigarette smoke, and city life mingle, creating a microcosm of urban experience. Air travel is beginning to shape American mobility. Jetliners carry business people, families, and adventurers to distant cities faster than ever, though airports are smaller, less regulated, and full of personality. Passengers wear hats, gloves, and polished shoes. Flight attendants glide down aisles with charm, offering drinks and snacks, while the hum of engines and announcements over the loudspeaker create an atmosphere of excitement and possibility. Air travel is glamorous, adventurous, and almost cinematic, a stark contrast to the uniform, regulated experience of today. Even pedestrians experience the streets differently. Sidewalks are alive with conversation. Children dart across intersections without formal crosswalks, and neighbors pause to exchange pleasantries. Streetlights exist, but people move with intuition and mutual awareness rather than strict adherence to traffic codes. Crossing a busy avenue is an exercise in judgment, observation, and social trust. And throughout all this, transportation is not just about movement. It is about culture, status, adventure, and identity. The rumble of a car engine, the whistle of a train, the laughter of children on bikes, the clatter of a bus rolling down Main Street, all are part of a symphony that defines 1960s America. The roads themselves are alive, echoing with stories, routines, and the absurd freedom of a world that trusted human skill over regulation, experience over technology, and exploration over safety. In 1960s America, food was not just nourishment, it was an experience, a statement of culture, and sometimes a little absurd. Family kitchens were centers of both routine and creativity. Mothers, or sometimes fathers, prepared meals from scratch, often balancing work, errands, and domestic responsibilities. Refrigerators were smaller, ice trays essential, and freezers a luxury for some. Ice boxes, still present in older homes, hummed quietly, keeping perishables cool with blocks of ice delivered weekly. Breakfast was an event. Children poured bright, sugary cereals into bowls. milk cascading over colorful pieces of cornflakes, Cheerios, or Lucky Charms. Toast popped from mechanical toasters, butter melted in perfect rivers, and the aroma of fried bacon or sizzling. Sausages filled kitchens. Coffee was a morning ritual, strong and black, sometimes sweetened, often drunk in large mugs that families held like talismans. Pancakes and waffles were served with syrup, sometimes alongside eggs or bacon, creating a feast that fueled a day of school, work, and play. Lunches for children were often packed in metal or plastic lunchboxes adorned with cartoon characters, superheroes, or the latest television stars. Sandwiches of peanut butter and jelly, slices of cold cuts, fruit, and cookies made their way into the hands of eager students. Milk cartons or thermoses of juice accompanied the meal. Unlike today's heavily regulated school lunches, there was no strict limit on sugar, salt, or fat. Kids carried sugary treats freely, and chocolate bars, soda, or even small candies were common. Fast food began to rise in prominence during this decade. Hamburger chains, ice cream parlors, and soda fountains spread across cities and towns. Families visited these establishments for convenience, novelty, and socializing. Milkshakes were thick, sodas came in glass bottles, and fries were liberally salted and often shared from a single paper tray. Drive-in restaurants were particularly popular, where cars lined up and car hops, sometimes on roller skates, delivered food directly to windows, creating a lively and slightly chaotic spectacle. Dinner, for many families, was the central meal of the day. Meatloaf, roasted chicken, fried fish, or pot roast often took center stage. Vegetables, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, accompanied. The main course and desserts ranged from pies to gelatin molds that jiggled in bright colors. Casseroles were a staple, sometimes containing combinations that today might seem strange. Green beans with cream of mushroom soup, or tuna with noodles and peas baked under a golden crust. Yet, these dishes were beloved, comforting, and a reflection of domestic ingenuity. Dining out carried its own culture. Diners offered breakfast all day, thick coffee in white mugs, and pie slices that seemed taller than the plates themselves. Waitresses in crisp uniforms called out orders, while jukeboxes filled the room with rock and roll or Motown hits. Meals were leisurely, social, and interactive. Soda fountains were not merely for drinks, they were meeting points for teenagers, where sundaes, floats, and malts were savored amid conversation and laughter. Snacks and convenience foods were gaining popularity, with items like TV dinners, potato chips, canned soups, and packaged cookies becoming common. These innovations reflected the growing pace of life, especially in urban areas. Families experimented with frozen meals heated in ovens, marveling at the technology that promised efficiency without sacrificing taste. Beverages were often as bold as the food itself. Soda, both in bottles and on tap, was a constant companion. Root beer floats, cola with ice, and flavored sodas were enjoyed freely. Coffee was consumed throughout the day by adults, often accompanied by cigarettes or light conversation. For celebrations, punch bowls filled with fruit juice, carbonated water, and sometimes even alcohol provided a centerpiece for gatherings. Regional foods added layers of diversity. In the South, fried chicken and collard greens dominated, while in the Midwest, casseroles, corn dishes, and hearty meats were staples. On the West Coast, seafood, salads, and fresh produce highlighted the culinary scene. Yet across the country, shared customs like sweet desserts, hearty breakfasts, and communal dinners tied the nation together in a tapestry of flavor, ritual, and nostalgia. Finally, absurdities of taste and indulgence were everywhere. Foods now considered unhealthy or bizarre were commonplace. Hot dogs smothered in chili, gelatin salads with shredded carrots or pineapple, and milkshakes with multiple scoops of ice cream stacked impossibly high. Sugar, fat, and salt were celebrated, not regulated. Eating was joyful, theatrical, and sometimes excessive, a sensory experience that reflected the optimism, abundance, and experimentation of the decade. Loved this video? Then hit that like button, share it with your friends, and anyone who needs a little inspiration today. Don't forget to check out our other videos, follow us on social, and join our community at wearebabyboomers.com. Links in the description.